What is victim blaming and why does it happen? This is printed in the Domestic Violence Services Network. It's time to shine a light on abuse and to educate the public about this extremely damaging and all too prolific issue. There are a lot of myths and misconceptions about domestic violence that can compound the problem and make it more injurious and demoralizing for victims and survivors. Abuse can be a challenging subject to discuss in theory, let alone someone who has experienced it. One of the Domestic Violence Services Network's core tenets, and something we strive to impart to all, is the importance of listening and believing without judgment. Unfortunately, too many people continue to blame and shame victims. The more individuals are aware of the impact of their words and actions, the more supportive we can all be on a personal and societal level. Victim blaming is, as the term suggests, when people place blame for abuse, either partially or completely, on the victim rather than the abuser. They may believe the victim did something to provoke their abuser, or perhaps that the victim could have prevented the abuse by being more careful or making different choices. Victim blaming can sometimes be a subconscious or visceral reaction that the blamer doesn't realize has such a devastating effect on the victim. What is victim shaming? Similar to victim blaming, victim shaming is when people, perhaps without implying the abuse is their fault per se, make victims feel like it's something to be ashamed of, or that no one outside of the relationship should know about. Shamers may make victims think they are weak for allowing this to happen to them, or that others will see them differently or more negatively if they knew. It causes victims to believe the abuse is something they must suffer through or figure out how to stop on their own. For those who have not experienced abuse, it's easy to think that if someone started hurting you, you would attempt to stop them or defend yourself by fighting back. This would be many people's reaction if a stranger attacked them, but it's different when someone you love and trust. There's a level of shock that can cause victims to freeze in disbelief that this is happening. They also care about their abuser and might not want to hurt them, even if they're being hurt by them. When people ask why they didn't fight back, it implies that the victim could have stopped the abuse or that they let it happen, and that it is in some way their fault. When most people think of domestic violence, they think of physical abuse. There are many forms of domestic violence, however, and some may be challenging to identify and may not seem like abuse to everyone. Things like financial abuse, gaslighting, reproductive coercion, sometimes met with skepticism and scorn. This reinforces the perception that these types of abuse are acceptable, just normal disagreements or power dynamics within relationships. Dismissing these more insidious forms of abuse can make the victim feel like they are taking it too seriously, or that it's a private issue they just have to deal with. This example is a common victim-blaming refrain in cases of sexual assault and rape. Just because two people have had sex before, are in a long-term relationship, or are married, does not mean sexual activity is obligatory. Any form of physical intimacy must be a conscious choice by both parties every time and at every stage. Some people still believe that marital rape is impossible. In fact, that it isn't a crime at all in the United States until 1993. The Me Too movement has done a lot to change the public's perception of sexual assault and harassment. But many still subscribe to the idea that certain levels of commitment in a relationship automatically denote perpetual consent. The way sex is generally viewed as an uncomfortable topic in society also adds to an aspect of shame even before the individual's reactions to the victim's experiences make them feel ashamed. Examples like this and similar, "What were you wearing?" or "Why did you go with him alone?" boil down to the same accusation that something the victim said or didn't say or do caused the abuse. It never would have happened if they weren't under the influence, were wearing something less revealing, or hadn't put themselves in a situation the abuser could take advantage of. While certain circumstances may rouse or aggravate them, or make it easier to abuse their victims, abusers always make a deliberate, considered choice of who, when, and where they abuse. Comments such as these make victims feel like they brought it on themselves and caused the abuse to occur. While the previous example placed blame on the victim's actions, this example excuses the abuser's actions because of a condition or health issue they have. Likewise, statements such as "he was drunk, he didn't know what he was doing," or "his father hit him, that's how he is raised," or "it's only because she's off her meds," attempt to justify the abuser's actions. Even if they don't blame the victim directly, they take the blame off the abuser and make the victim feel shamed of not being understood or sympathetic enough. People think the abuser is a hero who served the country bravely, or a wounded soul struggling to overcome a difficult childhood, and the resulting trauma is not their fault. While this may be true and these kinds of circumstances can exacerbate abusive tendencies, again, the abuser always has a choice about whether or not to express their difficulties by exerting power and control over someone else. A 2012 study found that participants were more likely to blame a victim if they were told they returned to the abuser than if they were told not told either way. There are many complex reasons why some victims either choose to remain with their abuser or return to them after leaving, including that it's even more dangerous for a victim to leave an abuser. For more details on these motivations, you can check out the blog post, "Why It's Not Always Safe or Right to Leave an Abuser." When people judge victims and survivors for their choices, it can lower their confidence, self-esteem, and autonomy. Their abuser already made them feel that way, and negative appraisals from those outside the relationship can compound the harmful effect of the assault and make them ashamed of their choices. Effects on victims' survivors. Sharing experiences of abuse with anyone can be extremely difficult to do, even without fear of judgment. When those that fear about the abuse react by blaming or shaming the victim, it can make victims wish they had never said anything. The fear of these reactions often keeps victims from doing anything to increase their safety, making them feel even more isolated and trapped. Victim blaming increases the risk of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and suicidal ideation in survivors. Blaming and shaming are also tactics some abusers use So experiencing them from someone outside the relationship can reinforce the abuser's power and control. Reliving the abuse by talking about it and receiving a negative or even aggressive response can be re-traumatizing and have a tremendously detrimental effect. Abusers can also use this reaction to reinforce their control over the victim by pointing out that other people don't think anything is wrong or that nobody will believe them. Even when friends and family believe victims and survivors and want to support them, their attempts can sometimes feel like blaming or shaming to the victim's survivor. Knowledge of abuse can cause people to view and or treat the victim's survivor differently. They may become angry, and while that anger is directed towards the abuser, the victim may still feel at fault for causing it by making them unaware of the abuse. Perhaps employers try to understand by giving the survivor time off, reducing their workload, or changing their tasks. Some survivors may see this as a negative consequence of the abuse and that their employer no longer feels they can handle their job, or that they're being punished, or even re-victimized for sharing their experiences. Loved ones may pressure a victim to see a medical professional or to report the abuse to the police, believing it's what needs to be done as in the victim's best interest. This can also feel like punishment or chastisement to the victim if they are not ready to share their story. Being forced to retell their story again to strangers in positions of authority can be traumatizing, take away their individual agency, and increase feelings of shame and blame. Even people like therapists and prevention advocates can inadvertently make the victim feel at fault by recommending ways to be more careful to try to prevent further abuse. Why do people blame victims? Stereotypes and myths. Myths and stereotypes about what constitutes abuse and who an abuser or victim is can cause surprise or disbelief. When people hear about an abusive situation that does not fall within what they think of as the norm, if the abuse is not physical, if a woman or adult child is the perpetrator, if the victim is very strong and masculine presenting, or if the abuser and or victim is wealthy, influential, queer, or non-binary, people may attempt to rationalize the disparity in their perceptions by blaming or shaming the victim. In a 2012 study, Perceptions of Domestic Violence, found that participants believing greater domestic violence myths perpetuated more blame to the victim than those believing fewer myths. A lack of knowledge and understanding of the issues of abuse leads to more victim blaming and shaming. Discomfort. People instinctually don't want to believe that bad things happen, especially when someone they know and or love is a perpetrator. They try to find reasons why the victim's story cannot be true. The thought that their friend or family member is an abuser makes them so uncomfortable that it's easier to imagine that the victim is lying. It's not necessarily that they don't want to believe this happened to the victim, but rather they don't want to believe that someone they love or admire could have been the one to do it. Their unwillingness to think the worst of the perpetrator can come out as victim blaming, trying to find reasons they could be mistaken or have provoked an incident. They project their discomfort on the victim in order to cope with their feelings. Just world hypothesis. Psychologists theorize that victim blaming is actually an ingrained bias. The just world hypothesis is based on the idea that people get what they deserve. If you're a good person, good things will happen. Conversely, bad things only happen to bad people. If someone is a victim of abuse, they must have done something to deserve it. Otherwise, the world must be unjust. People don't want to believe that because it means that no matter what they do, bad things could happen to them. According to Professor of Psychology Sherry Hamby, this just world bias is especially prominent in the United States, where the culture promotes the American dream and the idea that we control our destinies. As a general rule, Americans have a hard time with the idea that bad things happen to good people, she says. In my experience, people blame victims so they can continue to feel safe themselves. It can be a defense mechanism against bad news and a way to exert more control over their lives by preventing themselves from becoming victims as well. Moral values and perspectives. 4 studies conducted by psychology professor Leon Young and postdoctoral associate Lori Nemi found 2 major factors that contributed to the likelihood that someone would engage in victim-blaming behaviors. The first was their moral values, whether they were more inclined to exhibit individual or binding values. People with stronger individual values are more focused on fairness and preventing harm to individuals and were found to be more sympathetic to victims, while people with stronger binding values favor protecting the interest of a group as a whole and were more likely to see victims as blameworthy. When presented with a scenario of assault, participants with binding values more often assigned a responsibility to the victim and suggested things they could have done differently to change the outcome, compared with the opposite reaction in those with individual values. In the binding values participants' idea of society as a collective team, it must necessarily be the victim who did something wrong to cause the assault, not the group for creating a culture where the abuser would thrive. Or to some, perhaps the abuser's status as an important contributing member of society outweighs the harm that they did to one individual. The second factor is perspective. 2 versions of the assault scenario were presented to different groups, one from the perspective of the victim and the other from the perspective of the abuser. When the perpetrator was the subject of the scenario, ratings of victim blame and responsibility went down significantly, and suggestions of what the victim could have done to prevent the assault also decreased. It's an interesting finding because it does suggest that we want to be sympathetic and focus on victims and outpour our sympathy. Perhaps we might actually lead us to focus so much on victims and what they could have done that we actually neglect to focus on the agency of perpetrators and what they potentially could have done differently. According to this finding, society's emphasis on the victim's viewpoint and even the concentration on assisting them to the neglect of the perpetrator's actions and motivations may be inadvertently contributing to the culture of victim blaming. Avoiding blaming or shaming. So how to avoid this culturally reinforced psychological tendency to victim blame and shame? A good place to start is by listening to victims' and survivors' stories without judgment and letting them know you believe them, that the abuse was not their fault. Acknowledge how it must affect them and that you are there to support them however you can. Sharon Imperatto of the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center suggests considering the acronym SEEK when responding to survivors' disclosures. This stands for safety, empowerment, empathy, connection, and knowledge. Try to make the survivor feel safe, asking that about their concerns and needs. Recognize that survivors are the experts on their own lives. Give them options, including whether or not to ask questions or make use of resources, and what kind of support they would like, and let them make their own choices. Try to relate to their experience, and let them know they are not alone, and that you are there for them, and that there are others out there who can lend support and community. Let them know how you can help or seek other resources for them, while recognizing your limitations. According to psychologists, empathy is an especially huge factor in reducing victim blaming. In a 1974 study on empathetic observation of the innocent victim, participants watched a woman apparently receiving electric shock while making errors in a learning task. Some participants were simply told to watch her, while others were asked to imagine how they would feel in the same situation. Those who were told to watch tended to derogate the victim, while those asked to empathize with her tended not to. The empathy prompt made a significant difference in avoiding victim blaming. A 2007 study concluded that participants with greater levels of empathy tended to view survivors of rape more positively, and those with less empathy tended to view them more negatively. Not only does victim blaming and shaming marginalize and demoralize victims and make them less likely to report incidents of abuse to the police, seek support, or even share what was done to them with anyone, but on a societal level, it also minimizes the incredibly detrimental act the victim is being blamed for. In the case of domestic violence, victim blaming can make it seem like the issue is not universal and widespread as it is, but rather isolated incidents that were provoked and are preventable. It shifts the focus away from the perpetrators so that many are not held accountable. Learning more about what victim blaming sounds like and why it's all too easy to do can help increase awareness and empathy, and stigma and shame, and work towards a better future. The number for the Domestic Violence Services Network's helpline is 888-399-6111. This is toll-free and confidential. You can also go to dvsn.org/resources.